The cell block echoed with the sharp clang of steel doors, sound that carried both finality and fear. The new inmate walked in slow, measured steps, head low, hands steady, eyes unreadable. Around him, whispers crawled through the corridors like snakes. Fresh meat. That's what they called anyone new. But this one was different. His calmness wasn't fear, but it was focus. Up in the corner, leaning against the wall, a tall white gang leader watched him with a cruel grin. Tattoos marked his face like scars of dominance, symbols of hate etched deep into his skin. To him, the man entering the block was nothing more than prey. Another lesson, to teach about power, color, and control. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that this new inmate had once fought men twice his size in cages, under bright lights and roaring crowds. He wasn't just strong, he was disciplined, lethal, and patient. And though he'd walked into a prison, he'd left something far more dangerous outside. Mercy. The moment. Their eyes met. The air shifted. In that instant, a quiet storm began. Brewing, one that would soon shake the entire prison to its core. The morning haze inside cell block D always carried a certain heaviness, a mixture of sweat, disinfectant, and stale regret. Every sound had a rhythm. The distant buzz of flickering lights, the shuffle of boots against the concrete, the dull thud of fists against punching bags in the rec yard. For most inmates, it was just another day of survival. But for Marcus Hale, it was day one. He had been processed at dawn, stripped of his identity, and given a number that now defined him. Inmate 42167. The guards didn't care who he had been before. They didn't know he had once trained champions, that he had walked away from the violence of the ring to teach kids how to fight with discipline, not anger. To them, he was just another man in orange. As Marcus was led down the corridor, he noticed the eyes that followed him. Most were cautious, others curious. But one pair, cold, piercing, and filled with arrogance, belonged to someone who owned this block like a throne. His name was Travis Ironjaw Knox, the self-proclaimed king of Cell Block D, towering figure built like a freight train, with a shaved head and a swastika tattoo inked across his neck. Every inmate knew his name, and every guard quietly looked away when he passed. Knox had earned his reputation through fear. He was ruthless, unpredictable, and racist to the core. For him, domination wasn't about strength, it was about humiliation. He made an example of every new arrival who didn't fit his image of superiority. When Marcus was escorted into the communal area for the first time, the chatter fell silent. Knox's crew, a group of tattooed men sitting by the weight benches, all turned to look. It wasn't curiosity. It was challenge. Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes swept over the room, calm and detached, like a man scanning an opponent before a fight. But deep inside, a quiet tension coiled in his chest. He didn't want trouble. He wasn't here to prove anything. He just wanted to serve his time and disappear. He sat down at the far end of the cafeteria, quietly eating the tasteless food in front of him. But peace never lasted long in places like this. From across the room, Knox's voice cut through the air, loud, taunting, dripping with contempt. Though the words were meant to provoke, Marcus didn't react. He'd spent years mastering control. In the octagon, losing composure meant losing the fight. Here, losing composure could mean losing your life. Still, he could feel the weight of hate pressing closer. Knox wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone like Marcus, someone who looked different, someone he thought beneath him. By the second day, the rumors began to spread. Some said Marcus was ex-military. Others whispered that he was a preacher. The truth, that he was a retired MMA instructor who'd served time for defending a kid from a racist assault, stayed hidden. It wasn't shame that kept him quiet. It was wisdom. In prison, knowledge was power, and the less they knew about you, the safer you were. But Knox had a way of sniffing out strength, and he hated it. To him, strength in a man like Marcus was an insult to everything he believed. It wasn't long before Knox decided to make his move. That night, as lights out approached, Marcus could feel eyes on him from across the block. Shadows moved in silence, footsteps echoing down the corridor. The air was heavy, electric. Somewhere deep in the belly of the prison, The storm that had started with a single look was about to break wide open, and Marcus knew, no matter how much he tried to stay out of it, fate had already stepped into the ring. The lights dimmed, one by one, until the block was wrapped in a thick, uneasy darkness. Only the faint orange glow from the hallway lamps seeped through the iron bars, casting long, crooked shadows across the cell walls. Marcus sat on the edge of his cot, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. He could feel it coming, the shift in the air, that silent anticipation right before violence erupted. He'd felt it in the ring moments before the bell, when an opponent's breathing would change, shallow, uncertain. But here the stakes were different. There were no referees, no rules, no crowd to cheer, just men driven by hate, pride, and survival. Down the corridor, footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, and confident. Then came the whisper of metal against. Concrete, keys, locks, laughter. Marcus didn't move. He knew better than to react too soon. The door to his cell slid open with a harsh screech. In the dim light stood 3 men, Knox at the center, his grin carved with cruelty. Behind him, 2 of his loyal followers loomed, each carrying something that glinted faintly in the dark. "Welcome to D Block, champ," Knox muttered under his breath, his tone thick with mockery. He stepped inside, cracking his knuckles like he was warming up for a game. Marcus didn't respond. He just looked up, his expression calm, almost detached. That calmness, that lack of fear, angered Knox more than any insult ever. What happened next unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. One of Knox's men lunged first, a quick, reckless move meant to intimidate. Marcus stood up just as the man swung. The strike missed by inches. In one smooth motion, Marcus stepped aside, pivoted, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. The thug stumbled backward, crashing against the wall with a heavy thud. Knox's smirk faltered. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Before the second man could react, Marcus moved again, precise, controlled, almost surgical. A quick grip on the wrist, a twist, a step forward. And the man dropped to the floor, gasping in pain. No yelling, no chaos, just efficiency. Years of discipline condensed into seconds. Knox stood frozen, caught between rage and disbelief. He had picked his target thinking he'd find weakness. Instead, he'd found something else. A man who had already fought 1,000 battles and walked away from each one undefeated. But Marcus didn't strike again. He stepped back, breathing steady, eyes locked on Knox. "Leave," he said quietly, not as a threat, but as a fact. That word, that tone, stung more than any punch could. Knox snarled, his pride burning hotter than his fear. He rushed forward, fists flying in blind fury. Marcus didn't even flinch. He deflected, absorbed, redirected. Every motion fluid, deliberate, unhurried. When Knox finally hit the ground, the silence that followed was deafening. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't speak. He simply turned away and sat back on his cot, as if nothing had happened. By morning, the story had spread across the entire prison. Whispers of what had happened in cell D13 reached every corner. Some said Marcus broke Knox's jaw. Others claimed he moved so fast the guards didn't even hear the fight. No one knew the truth. And Marcus preferred it that way, but the fight had changed everything. Now, men who once ignored him gave him space. Some nodded in quiet respect. Others kept their distance out of fear. Yet Marcus wasn't proud. He hadn't come here to prove strength. He'd come to survive. And yet, by defending himself, he had stepped into a dangerous spotlight. Knox spent 3 days in the infirmary. When he came back, his silence was louder than his threats. The gang watched him closely. The cracks in their leader's confidence were beginning to show. Still, hate doesn't die easily. It festers. It waits. Over the next few weeks, tension gripped cell block D like a vice. The guards noticed the shift, fewer outbursts. Quieter mealtimes, but they didn't understand why. Marcus kept to himself, spending hours in the rec yard doing push-ups, shadowboxing and meditating. Every move was methodical, measured, peaceful, but it also reminded everyone watching that, beneath that calm, exterior was controlled power. Knox, on the other hand, stewed in his humiliation. His men began whispering behind his back, questioning his dominance. The racial slurs that once echoed through the block now came less often, replaced by an uneasy silence whenever Marcus passed, and then came the breaking point. One afternoon, while inmates were out in the yard, Knox saw Marcus talking quietly with an older black inmate named Reggie, a man everyone respected for his wisdom and kindness. The sight lit a fuse. To Knox, it looked like Marcus was building alliances, challenging him not just with fists, but with influence. By the time the sun dipped below the prison walls, Knox had made his decision. If he couldn't scare Marcus, he'd destroy what gave him peace. That night, when Marcus returned to his cell, he found Reggie's bunk empty. The guard said there had been an incident in the laundry room. No witnesses, no cameras, just blood. Marcus sat on his cot in silence, staring at the floor. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from something deeper. Grief, anger, injustice. For years, he'd taught others to channel rage into discipline, but now that lesson felt hollow. The world had shown him that sometimes even control couldn't save the innocent. Somewhere deep inside, a familiar fire reignited the one he'd buried after leaving the ring. He took a slow breath. The storm that had started with a glance was about to return stronger, colder, and far more dangerous. This time, Marcus wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for justice. The following night, the air inside cell block D felt heavier than usual, thick with an unspoken tension that clung to every wall. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, humming like angry wasps. Marcus sat on his cot, motionless. But inside his chest, his pulse pounded like war drums. Reggie's death wasn't random. Everyone knew it. But no one would say a word. Prison wasn't a place for justice. It was a place for silence. Yet, as Marcus stared at the cold floor beneath his feet, he knew silence was complicity. He had spent his whole life teaching others how to defend themselves, how to rise above hatred. But now that same hatred had taken the only man in this place who showed him kindness. Knox had crossed a line, one that couldn't be ignored. That night, when the block settled into uneasy sleep, Marcus stood and began wrapping strips of cloth around his knuckles torn from his bedsheet. Crude but enough. He wasn't planning revenge out of anger. It was purpose. He waited, listened. The faint rhythm of the guards. Boots faded down the corridor. The last click of the lock echoed, signaling lights out. Then silence. Marcus stepped out, his movements quiet, deliberate. Every sound, every breath calculated. The moonlight spilling through, the high windows painted silver lines. Across the concrete floor, guiding him toward the gym, area the one place the cameras didn't. Reached Knox was there. Just as Marcus expected, lifting weights, surrounded by two of his loyal men. He turned when he heard footsteps, his lips curling into a sneer. "Couldn't sleep, champ?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Marcus said nothing. He simply stood, eyes fixed, posture calm like a predator that no longer needed to announce its hunt. The silence stretched until it broke with the sound of metal hitting concrete. A dumbbell dropped, echoing like thunder. Knox lunged first, driven by ego and hate. His swing was wide, furious, the kind that came from emotion, not training. Marcus slipped under it effortlessly, his body moving with precision born from years of combat discipline. One strike to the ribs, controlled, precise. Another to the shoulder. Knox stumbled back, gasping, the arrogance draining from his face. The two followers rushed in, shouting, but Marcus didn't hesitate. He pivoted, elbow snapping backward, connecting with a jaw. A knee strike followed, swift and devastating. The second man tried to grab him, but Marcus turned, gripped, twisted the man, crumpled to the ground, choking for breath. Now it was just Marcus and Knox. "Reggie didn't deserve to die," Marcus said quietly. His voice wasn't angry. It was cold, the kind of calm that carried truth like a blade. Knox snarled, spitting blood. "You don't belong here," he growled. "People like you." Before he could finish, Marcus moved. A flash of motion, a perfect takedown. In seconds, Knox was on the ground, pinned, gasping under Marcus's weight. Years of fights had taught him exactly how much force it took to end a man, and how much to stop just short of it. Marcus's fist hovered above Knox's face. He could end it. Right here, right now. One strike, one release, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned close, his voice a whisper. This isn't about strength. It never was. It's about choice. Knox's eyes, wide with fear, darted toward the door, but there was no escape. Marcus stood slowly, breathing steady, letting go of the rage he'd carried for years. He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Knox beaten but alive, a man forced to face the humiliation of mercy. As Marcus reached the door, guards burst in, alerted by the noise. Flashlights flared, voices shouted. He didn't resist. He raised his hands, silent, calm, surrendering not to them, but to fate. They dragged him away. Shackles clinking while Knox lay on the floor, his chest heaving, eyes full of disbelief. For the first time, the self-proclaimed king of Cell Block D had been dethroned not by violence, but by restraint. In the following days, rumors spread faster than fire. Some said Marcus nearly killed Knox. Others swore Knox begged for mercy. But what really spread wasn't fear, it was respect. The block had changed. Inmates began to look at Marcus not as another prisoner, but as a symbol, a reminder that power didn't come from hate, and that even in a place built on division, a man could still choose integrity. Knox, meanwhile, retreated into silence. The tattoos of hate on his body couldn't protect him from the truth he'd been forced to face. The men who once followed him now kept their distance. Marcus spent weeks in solitary confinement after the fight. No light, no sound, just his own thoughts echoing off the concrete walls. But in that solitude, he found peace, a quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is refusing to become what they expect you to be. When the door to his cell finally opened, he stepped out not as a broken man, but as someone transformed. The storm had passed, but its impact was just beginning to unfold when Marcus stepped back into the main block after weeks of isolation. The prison didn't sound the same anymore. The chaos, the constant noise, the cruel laughter, all of it had quieted, as if the walls themselves had witnessed something they couldn't forget. Even the guards who once looked past him now glanced with silent recognition. The inmates watched him walk down the corridor, slow, steady, unbroken. No one spoke, but the silence said everything. He wasn't feared for his fists. He was respected for his restraint. In the yard, the autumn light spilled across the cracked concrete, and the air felt different, lighter, freer, even behind bars. The same men who once sneered at him now nodded in quiet respect. A few even approached him during exercise hours, not for protection, but for guidance. Marcus never sought power, yet somehow he had redefined it. Not through dominance, but through dignity. One afternoon, while sitting under the rusted basketball hoop, a young inmate approached, barely 20, eyes sharp with confusion and anger. He hesitated before speaking. "You could have killed him," he muttered. "Why didn't you?" Marcus looked at him for a long moment. His face was calm, voice even. "Because if I had," he said, "then hate would have won twice." The boy frowned, not fully understanding, but something in his tone stuck. A seed of thought that would grow in time. Days passed, then weeks. Life in prison continued, meals, counts, lights out, but something subtle had shifted. The racial tension that once simmered like an open flame began to cool. The white gang that Knox led slowly fractured, loyalty fading into silence. Without fear binding them, their power dissolved. Knox himself was a different man. Gone was the swagger, the arrogance. He spent hours alone now, staring at the walls that had once echoed his laughter. The bruises on his face healed, but something deeper hadn't. The pride that once made him cruel had cracked. One day in the cafeteria, Marcus noticed him sitting alone. No one sat beside him anymore. For a moment, their eyes met, not in anger, but in something closer to recognition. Marcus gave a small nod, not of friendship, but of closure. Knox didn't look away. He nodded back ever so slightly, the gesture carrying more weight than words ever could. That moment wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding that both men, in their own ways, had been prisoners long before the bars. Months later, Marcus's parole hearing came. The board reviewed his record: no infractions, no violent conduct, multiple letters from staff about his influence on inmate behavior. When he stood before them, his voice was calm, steady. He didn't plead. He didn't justify. He simply said, "I'm not here to prove I've changed. I'm here to show I never stopped trying." They granted his parole. On the morning of his release, the sun broke through the gray clouds as the gates slid open. The world outside looked both new and familiar, like stepping into a dream that had waited patiently. Marcus stood there for a long moment, breathing in freedom, the scent of wet asphalt, distant traffic, open air. As he walked away from the prison, he didn't look back. Some places didn't deserve goodbyes. In the months that followed, Marcus found work at a youth gym in the city, the same kind of place where he'd once taught before everything fell apart. The kids there listened differently when he spoke. They saw the calm in his eyes, the quiet strength in his movements. He never mentioned prison, never bragged about fighting. But when he taught them how to defend, he always said the same thing. The strongest person in the room isn't the one who can hurt. It's the one who can stop themselves from doing it. Word spread. Former inmates came by. Some just to see him, others to talk. Even a few guards stopped in during off hours, curious about the man who'd turned violence into virtue. And every night, after the lights dimmed and the gym emptied, Marcus would sit in the corner near the heavy bags, watching the dust dance through the fading light. Somewhere in his memory, Reggie's voice still echoed calm. Wise, forgiving, he had lost a friend, but gained a purpose. One evening, while closing up, Marcus saw a familiar face at the door. Knox. Older, thinner, eyes softer than before. He didn't wear the hate on his skin the way he used to. The tattoos were still there, but their meaning had faded. "I heard you were out," Knox said quietly. Marcus nodded. "I heard you made parole too." For a moment, they stood in silence. Then Knox said, "I'm not the same man I was." Marcus studied him, not with judgment, but with understanding. "None of us are," he said simply. Knox nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving Marcus in the stillness of the night. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't redemption. It was something in between, a fragile peace, born from pain and choice. As Marcus locked up the gym, he looked at his reflection in the glass door. Older, wiser, free. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "The fight's never about who's stronger. It's about who refuses to hate." The city lights glowed behind him as he stepped into the night, the sound of his footsteps fading into quiet resolve. And somewhere out there, beyond the noise of the world, a single truth lingered, that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not in cages or prisons, but within the human heart.